Welcome to the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal Community Information Webinar. My name is Lyndall McLennan and I will be hosting tonight's webinar. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I'm calling in from, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bunurong people as the traditional owners of the land and sea country of Western Port, the location of the proposed Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal, and the waters where the Port of Hastings operates. We honour their enduring connection to land, waters and community. And we from the Port of Hastings extend our respect to all First Nations people, their culture, their elders, past and present. And if you do so wish, I also invite attendees to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you are joining us tonight as well. You can do this by using the chat function. On this slide, you can actually see an image that the Port of Hastings commissioned late last year by a local Bunurong woman, Vicky Thomas. This image depicts the varied marine life in Western Port, including masses of seagrass, jellyfish, turtles, seahorses, ghost shrimp, fish, dolphins, and of course our waterbirds. And you'll be hearing a bit about the work we're doing to investigate these important ecosystems later in the presentation. So thank you for taking the time to join us this evening, mostly to learn more about the project. But before we start the proceedings, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. We will have a dedicated Q&A after the project presentations are finished, and it will be at this point where we will try and get through as many questions as we can. At any time throughout the webinar, please type in your questions using the QA function at the top of your screen, and they will be queued for answers after the presentations. You can also upvote other questions by clicking the vote button. I'd like to note that all questions asked will be public to everybody joining us this evening. So please ask your questions respectfully, as this is a public forum. If you have any technical issues, please try refreshing your Teams window, or you can, of course, rejoin the session at any point. And a final note to say that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our project website in the coming weeks. So on the screen, we have our agenda for tonight's webinar. Peter Watt, Project Director at the Port of Hastings, he will be starting this session with an introduction to the project and share some visuals, including 2 short animations to give you a sense of how our operation and construction will take shape. Following this, Natasha Reischneider, our approvals manager, will talk through the environmental assessment process and provide an update on our recently submitted EPBC referral. Next, we will hear from Peter Crocker from RPS, who will share some of his preliminary findings and insights from our marine ecology studies. And to wrap up the presentations tonight, we'll hear from Claire Tingate and Dr. Americ von Mart from Biosis, who will take us through the Waterbirds impact assessment work that is currently underway. And this will include some particularly interesting tracking data that I'm sure that you'll be very interested to learn about. So once we've heard from the team, we'll open the session to your questions. So to get us started, I will now pass over to Peter, who will share a short animation that introduces the project.
Good. Thank you very much, Lyndall, and welcome everybody, and really appreciate everybody's interest in this project. And we hope we can give you a really good summary about the work that we've done to date and some key aspects of the project. A little about myself: I've got about 35 years experience, which has been predominantly in the port and marine sector. I've been working for the Port of Hastings for over 7 years now and have a pretty significant experience in port operations, logistics, port planning and design. And this particular project is probably one of the most satisfying of my career to date because this is about renewable energy, it's about transition to net zero, and it's about leaving that legacy for future generations. So we'll now go on to the first of 3 animations that we've got. And this animation gives you an overview of the offshore wind industry and where the port fits into that.
is establishing a thriving offshore wind industry, paving the way for our state to host the first offshore wind energy projects in Australia. Wind blows much more consistently out at sea, and Victoria has some of the best offshore wind resources in the world to support a clean energy future. The Port of Hastings has been selected as the location for the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal and, subject to the necessary approvals, will become the dedicated assembly port to import, pre-assemble and transport offshore wind components to wind farms in Bass Strait off the Gippsland coast of Victoria. Offshore wind production refers to energy that is generated when winds at sea turn large turbines, producing clean, reliable and renewable electricity. The electricity produced travels through undersea cables from the turbines to a land-based substation, where it is connected into the existing transmission grid infrastructure. To construct an offshore wind farm, supply ships first deliver the wind turbine components to the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal at the Port of Hastings. These components will be stored at the terminal and include the foundations, towers, blades and power generation units. Some wind turbine components, such as the tower segments, will then be pre-assembled at the terminal before being loaded onto specialised installation vessels for transport to offshore wind farms. The installation vessels will transport and install the wind turbines at their locations in Bass Strait off the Gippsland coast. Each installation vessel can carry and install multiple wind turbines before returning to the terminal for reloading. Victoria's offshore wind farms will produce 2 gigawatts of power by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035 and 9 gigawatts by 2040. 2 gigawatts of power is enough to power 1.5 million homes. Specialised port infrastructure is required to support offshore wind construction due to the size and weight of offshore wind components. The Port of Hastings has been selected as the most suitable location for the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal, with the benefit of having large areas of available land next to deep water channels, proximity to proposed offshore wind farms and adequate channel capacity to manage specialist vessel movements. The Port of Hastings Corporation will develop the terminal in consultation with traditional owners, communities and industry. Together, we can support clean, renewable wind energy for our future. For more information about the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal project, sign up to receive updates via our website.
So as we can see from the animation, there are 3 key components to get offshore wind generation. You need a port as that assembly and lay down storage area for the turbine components. You need the construction of the offshore wind turbines out in the Bass Strait in the declared offshore wind zones. And then you need that to connect up to the transmission so that we can get the power into the Victorian transmission network. So I'll now focus on the port and the Port of Hastings. So we're located in Western Port, about 70 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. There are 4 commercial working ports in Victoria. It's Port of Hastings, Port of Portland, Port of Melbourne and the Port of Geelong. We've been operating for almost 60 years. There was a lot of development done in the late 60s and early 70s. So we've been operating for many, many years and which is not everybody realises just how long we've been in operation. We're characterised by a natural deep water channel and also have significant areas of land within the port areas, which is zoned for port-related use. At the moment, we do import and export of predominantly crude oil, LPG, petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, and also steel. So we're predominantly fossil fuels, and fossil fuels that will diminish over time as the oil and gas reserves run out. And we see the Port of Hastings will play a key role in the energy transition as we head towards net zero. So why Port of Hastings? Why has Port of Hastings been chosen by the Victorian Government as a preferred location for this offshore wind terminal? So First of all, the Victorian Government has conducted extensive assessments about different locations for a port facility or marine terminal, and it's landed on the Port of Hastings for a number of reasons. So we've got a number of superior attributes to other locations, and that includes proximity to the offshore wind zones. We're the closest commercial port to the Gippsland offshore wind zone. We've got an existing shipping channel, which is more than deep enough to handle the vessels that are required for the offshore wind, offshore wind installation vessels. There's just a small part at the northern part of the channel that needs a bit of deepening. We have a lot of land area, which I mentioned, 3,500 hectares of zoned land for port-related uses. So if any complementary industries or support facilities crop up for the offshore wind industry, we can accommodate that. Reduce carbon footprint, because we're the closest in proximity to the offshore wind zones, it reduces that carbon from the shipping emissions from the vessels. We also can provide what we call a single port solution. So the offshore wind developers have two main construction packages. One is for the foundations and the other one is for the wind turbine generator units, which is the towers, the blades and the nacelle units. We have sufficient land and ability to build a sufficient length of berth, shipping berths, so that both of those contracts can be done in the one location. We also have that capacity to deliver within the required timeframes, which are legislated by the Victorian Government for offshore wind, which is 2 gigawatts by 32, 4 gigawatts by 2035 and 9 gigawatts by 2040. And lastly, we're also fully government owned. Government can provide the certainty about developments and investment, as opposed to dependence on the private industry or private sector. So this is a visual or a photograph which covers the different Port of Hastings facility. In the south, we have the Stony Point jetty, and then coming further up to the north, the Crib Point jetty, and then the Long Island Point liquids berth, which supports the Esso fractionation plant, existing plant. Then we have this area of land for the proposed project location, which you'll hear, it's called the Old Tyabb Reclamation Area, which is that green, the green pasture land, which you can see within the red dotted perimeter, and we'll also be intending to reclaim out into Western Port. And then further to the north is the BlueScope Steel wharves, and a bit out of picture is the steel manufacturing plant, which completes, the Port of Hastings, the facilities within the Port of Hastings. So we'll go next slide. Now, in terms of our location in respect to Western Port, you can see point number 2, that's the project location. And this plan shows the Ramsar wetland and the entirety of Western Port. So the Ramsar wetland is shown by the blue hashed outline. Natasha, my colleague, will talk more about the Ramsar wetlands in her presentation. But the area of the site where we're, in terms of the reclamation into the Ramsar, is about 18 hectares, and the blue hashed area, the entirety of the Ramsar wetland, is about 60,000 hectares. So it's about 0.03% in terms of area against the total Ramsar area. This is what the terminal will look like once built. So everything you can see there is existing, except for the area within the yellow dotted perimeter. So the terminal will essentially be one big laydown area for these big turbine components. So we have an animation coming up now, which we'll go to Liam. And so this animation, I'll be able to describe those turbine components. and the sort of operations that is done within the terminal. So that's the terminal, what it will look like once it's built. So this animation zooms around the terminal and shows different components. We'll have administration and warehouse building and car parking. You can see those 3 stacked items, they're turbine blades. Sorry, I'm just getting a few texts, no sound, but hope there's no sound with the animation, it's just my voice. Now this shows a vessel that's come in delivering jacket structures. And what happens, those jacket structures are transferred through a roll-on, roll-off operation from the vessel back onto the terminal facility. That operation is done by self-propelled modular transporter units, also commonly referred to as SPMTs. So they will go onto the vessel, they will pick up the jacket structures and then manoeuvre them around to their location on the terminal where they are stored. This is a vessel carrying wind turbine blades. They'll be unloaded from cranes which are mounted on the quay side, and they'll be put into frames and loaded onto SPMTs, or the self-propelled modular transporter units. And then the SPMTs will go and manoeuvre or drive those to their location of storage. You can see the size of the man versus the height of the blade. So these components are all very large, and the components for offshore wind are much larger than for onshore wind. This part of the animation is showing assembly of towers. So towers will often come in 3 or 4 pieces when they're delivered to the terminal, but then they need to get assembled into a complete length of tower section. So this is showing the individual pieces being placed on top of one another, and then they get bolted together, and then they are fitted out with stairways and high voltage infrastructure. And the vessel that you can see there is an offshore installation vessel. So this particular vessel is picking up, I think it's 4 or 5 sets of the wind turbine generator units comprising towers. Those are nacelle units which sit on top of the tower. And then 3 sets of blades per unit, so possibly 15 blades there, and the blades connect onto the nacelles. So then this vessel will now depart Western Port. It will sail 220 nautical miles or thereabouts out into the Bass Strait, and it will then go and assemble or construct the wind turbine towers. After it's constructed those towers, it then comes back to the Port of Hastings and gets another set of towers, or alternatively getting another set of foundation units. So I mentioned during the animation that the size of these components are very, very large. This is a photograph of 2 of my colleagues, which is taken over in Europe, and they're standing next to a foundation unit called a monopile. So that monopile is 8.6 metres in diameter, but coming through our terminal, they could be up to 12 metres perhaps. So these componentry, you can categorise them as they're very heavy, geometrically very big, and thus the need for a very heavy-duty terminal that can handle these very large loads and that has a significant amount of storage and lay-down space so that you can receive components and then get them back onto the installation vessels. We'll move on to the next to the animation. So this is now a construction animation. So this shows one of the potential techniques for going and constructing the facility. So our team's done quite a lot of work in terms of working up concept and what we call reference designs. And this will show the outcome of these reference designs. So the first part of this animation is showing the declared offshore wind zones, which is where all the turbine units are constructed in the offshore wind farms. The dark blue area is the shipping channel, and that's the location of the Renewable Energy Terminal, which is in between the fractionation plant and the BlueScope Steel manufacturing plant. So it's got quite a heavily industrialised area. So the first, some of the key activities are now coming up on the screen, but we'll go through those in a little bit more detail. Good. So, so the proposed development comprises, initially, if we get the environmental approvals, comprises mobilisation on the site. We start to bring quarry material onto the existing land, the Old Tyabb Reclamation Area, and then we also start to build bunds out into Western Port. At that stage, we commence dredging works. So the dredging is required to deepen the shipping channel in the vicinity of the VRET terminal, and also provide a sufficient depth at the berth for the vessels to lay alongside the quay wall during all states of the tide. So the work's going on here is we're doing dredging, we're constructing bunds, we've got silk curtains that have been put up to help contain the turbidity from the dredging process. And then we start doing the piling works. So the piling is, that's the front of the wharf facility, and that's a key component of what we call the quay wall. With the dredging works, all the material that is dredged will be beneficially reused. So what that means is that that will be put back into the reclamation area. So we don't have to dispose any of it offshore, or alternatively in a different onshore site. It will all be contained within the terminal boundary. This is putting down scale protection. So we put a rock layer of scale protection to prevent erosion from vessels' propellers or tugs' thrusters. And then we have to do a series of ground improvement works on the site, being conscious of the significant loads that will be applied from these very heavy turbine components. So some of those blue pieces of plant and equipment are doing some ground improvement works by augering in some cement into the soil. Here there's piling works to help, the piling helps to support the quay wall, and also what we call the quay apron, which is a very heavy duty area where the components are unloaded off the vessel and onto the terminal, or vice versa. This is some additional piling that's going on, again, as part of strengthening the ground so that we can support these significant loads. And as we're doing that, we're paving out the whole facility. And there we are. And then it's complete. So essentially it's one big storage area, small amount of administration building, and it's a 40-hectare site all up. So in terms of, a number of you may be aware, or perhaps not, that in 2023 we put in what is called an EPBC referral. Natasha will be referring to this in more detail, but it's a referral made up to the federal government. This is the envelope that we had for our 2023 referral. the blue area is existing land, the green area is the reclamation out into Western Port, and the yellow area is the envelope for the dredging works. The federal government came back and said, gave us what is called completely unacceptable, and they supported that with a number of reasons. They produced a document called the Statement of Reasons, and they basically said, go and relook at the project and look to see what you can do to go and reduce it, because at the moment it's perceived to be too large given the Ramsar wetland. So and Liam will go to the next slide. So we have just recently put in a new referral and gone through in detail the Commonwealth Government's reasons for that previous decision. And we've come up with a new refined scheme, which we have a significant reduction in dredging and reclamation footprints. So the dredging footprint's being reduced by about 70% and the reclamation area by about 35%. So Natasha will talk more about the referral that's currently up for public submission at the moment. Good. So I'll now hand over to Natasha.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. My name's Natasha Reifschneider, and I'm the Approvals Manager for the VREP project. My background is in planning and environmental assessments for major projects. So for the VREP project to go ahead, Port of Hastings needs approval from both the state and the Commonwealth Government. Firstly, this evening, I'm going to explain the Commonwealth assessment process, which is legislated under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. This is Australia's national environmental law, and it applies when a project could significantly impact Commonwealth recognised values. The VREP project is not a zero harm project. We're proposing to build a terminal, so of course we will be anticipating environmental impacts. For our project, this includes 3 key Commonwealth values that the project has the potential to impact on, and those are Ramsar wetlands, which are internationally recognised and protected, listed threatened species and ecological communities, and listed migratory species. As Peter mentioned earlier, we submitted our referral under the Commonwealth EPBC Act in 2023, and we provided a broad project area, and it was determined that the project in this previous form was not acceptable. So since this decision, we've done a lot of work. We've gathered a significant amount of environmental data and reshaped the project to better respond to the issues raised. And as Peter mentioned before, we've learned from that process, and now we have submitted a new referral for a modified project. So how is our new referral different? It's very different because the project is different to the 2023 project. We have been not only doing a lot of work since the 2023 referral, but we've also been engaging with agencies and stakeholders to understand their concerns. As Peter said earlier, the dredging envelope for this new referral and this modified design has been reduced by 70%, and the reclamation area reduced by 35%. Our new referral includes robust scientific evidence that demonstrates that there won't be an unacceptable impact on Commonwealth environmental values. So this is based on scientific data and investigations, which we'll hear a bit more about later. What we've found is the potential impacts are small and localised, and they don't affect the ecological character of the Ramsar site. We've also developed an offset strategy that outlines that there is a viable pathway to offset any unavoidable impacts. So what's in our referral submission? At the core of it is the referral form, which outlines the project details and how we've addressed the environmental considerations. Alongside that, we have 18 supporting attachments, and these provide the scientific evidence, the technical studies and the expert assessments to back up the information in the form. Together, these present a comprehensive picture of the project and demonstrate that we're managing environmental risks and should be in a position to continue our assessments for the project. On our project website, and I'll ask Liam just to drop in the chat, please, there's a link to a short video which will guide you through each of these documents and explain what's in those documents, because there is a lot of information. So the next slide provides an overview of the EPBC Act referral assessment process. It explains the steps involved from submission through to the final decision being made. So where we are at the moment is the referral is open for public comment, and anyone that is interested can go on the DQ website in the public portal and review the information we've provided the Commonwealth and make a submission responding to that information. Those submissions are due up until the 16th of July is the time frame that you have to make that submission. And then after that time, the Commonwealth will make their decision as to whether the project should continue the assessment process. And the next slide provides an overview of what you'll see on the right-hand side there. That's the public portal, so that's what it will look like if you log into the Commonwealth website. And I'll just ask Chantal if you could please just drop in the chat a link to the EPBC referrals. So if anyone online is interested, they can click on that link and have a look at the information that we have submitted on the project. This slide provides a very brief overview of the findings of our preliminary assessments, which are included in that EPBC referral. We've done the work to investigate the issues outlined by the Commonwealth Government in their statement of reasons that was released in 2023. And we have found that, yes, there are impacts on the environment. And however, what we have found is that so far from this scientific evidence, the ecological character of Western Port can be maintained. That's what the science is telling us. And while there are impacts, they're small, localised and manageable. And tonight we have our specialists presenting on Waterbirds and the marine ecology. So we'll hear more from them after I've spoken this evening, and they'll give you an overview of their studies and what they've found and how we've come to those conclusions. So in addition to the Commonwealth assessment process, there's also, of course, the Victorian environmental assessment process. Before any major project can proceed in Victoria, especially one such as VCAT, which has the VRET, which has the potential to impact on the environment, it may need to go through the Environment Effects Statement or EES process. This process is the most comprehensive environmental impact assessment process in the state, and it helps ensure that the environmental, social and economic impacts are thoroughly investigated and tested before any key decisions are made. So the environmental assessment process, it's not a project approval, but it provides information that can be relied upon by regulators to help make decisions on the project under other legislation. Similar to the Commonwealth EPBC Act process, the first step in the assessment process is to make a referral, And Port of Hastings did this for the VREP project a couple of years back, and it was determined an EES was required. And as you may be aware, we're working away on that EES. Following the referral, the government released the scoping requirements, and these are a set of guidelines that set out what it is that we have to consider as we prepare our environmental assessment documentation. Preparing the EES, which is the stage that we're at now, this is where we get to work. This is where we look at the technical studies, we do community engagement, and we engage with regulators on the project. And we look at the project, we look at the environment, the project impacts, and we also see how any of the impacts that we are finding from our studies can be managed and mitigated. And then finally, the last two steps there are public review. So that's when the environmental effect statement goes on public exhibition and the community has an opportunity to make any submissions to the Minister for Planning. And the Minister for Planning appoints an independent panel to consider public submissions and make a recommendation as to whether the environmental impacts are acceptable. So in terms of the technical studies, which are a really important part of the environmental assessment process, there's 21 technical studies being undertaken for our project that will be available to the public when we go on public exhibition. These are expert studies done by scientists, engineers and specialists, and they closely examine how the project impacts the environment. They look at things like air quality impacts, noise, water, marine, waterbirds, and even other aspects such as cultural heritage. So the main purpose of these studies is to provide evidence. They're not just guessing or opinions. They're based on data, modelling and fact, and they help us understand the potential risks or impacts and whether they can be avoided or reduced or managed. These studies also help guide the design of the project, and they give the government, decision makers and the community confidence that the environmental risks have been properly considered and mitigated wherever possible. In short, these studies are really core foundation of the environmental assessment process. And today we'll be focusing on the marine ecology and the Waterbirds technical studies. So further to that, I'd like to introduce Peter Crockett, who will be providing an overview of the marine ecology impact assessments thus far. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Natasha, and good evening, everyone. I've been working on this project since late 2022, leading the marine ecology team at RPS. And prior to that, I've been working in marine ecology for a bit over 15 years, and since at least 2009, working in Western Port on a range of projects. So really comfortable working in the Western Port environment. The next slide is a conceptual model of the Western Port Ramsar site. And I wanted to start here because the Ramsar site, as noted in Peter's presentation earlier, is one of the key factors in assessing the project. So it's a matter of national environmental significance in its own right. And the key question for the project is, will it have a significant adverse impact on the ecological character of the Western Port Ramsar site? The ecological character of the Ramsar site is made up of three essential elements and a number of critical components, processes and services, and there are some supporting components, processes and services. So these are the things we're focusing the studies on, because to understand what an impact on ecological character is, you need to understand what the impact on those components might be. For our work, we're looking at things like water quality. That's a really key component for the project, but also for the ecosystem. Looking at the habitats, particularly those that may be impacted by the reclamation and dredging directly, but further afield, the seagrasses in particular, because of turbid dredge plumes. We've been looking at mangroves and salt marsh as well. We're doing a map of the entire Ramsar site at the moment, and also some of the higher levels in the ecosystem. So we're looking at marine invertebrates, both the infauna living in the sediments and the epifauna, and the fish. And you'll see there's a range of other things in there as well. And when I go through the studies we're working on, you'll see waterbirds are in the scope that Biosis will be talking about. So the team is not just RPS. We do have a lot of marine scientists, but the range of studies means we're supported by a whole lot of sub-consultants, in particular the ones shown on the screen there. And they're supporting us with things like aerial surveys for the intertidal habitats, water quality monitoring equipment, statistical analysis, the fish studies, which are quite specialist, and then a range of the other studies we're doing in the field. Thanks, Liam. So what are the aims? Any project, one of the first things you need to do is to describe the existing environment, and we're focused on the marine biodiversity. So that's everything from the high water mark down, excluding the birds, and other ecological values. We've got, as I mentioned, we're doing lots of water quality monitoring. A part of that is monitoring underwater light. That's the light that the seagrasses and other photosynthetic organisms use to grow and capture energy. Fish surveys, seagrass monitoring, sedimentation monitoring, invertebrate monitoring. We've made a desktop assessment of what introduced species are already in the port, and all of our studies consider whether we're detecting new introduced species. There's been a big focus on habitat mapping as one of the key things the project needs to consider is the effect of that reclamation of intertidal mudflat habitat and dredging of the deeper seabed. Also looking at mangroves near the project site because they grow right up to the edge. And this information we use to assess the potential impacts to the ecological values of the site during the construction and in the future operation for the terminal. And we also use this information to recommend appropriate mitigation, monitoring and contingency measures to manage identified potential impacts. Thanks, Liam. So the map on this slide shows the extent of our water quality and sedimentation studies. There's a number of points on there. There's a few there that the orange ones are sites that have been monitored by EPA Victoria for 30 years or more. Those are not part of our program, but we are using their data as a sort of an additional bit of evidence for what we're working on. Our water quality monitoring sites consist of those 5 fixed water quality monitoring sites, and they're through North Arm and Upper North Arm. There's also a mobile water quality monitoring program that has 11 sites, including the 5 sites where there's the fixed water quality monitoring equipment, and they go from the confluence zone. So that's the area where the current's coming in to Western Port, branch out into East Arm and Upper North Arm, where a lot of mixing of water goes on. And then the sites are arrayed right up through Lower North Arm, where the port facilities are on both sides of Lower North Arm, and right up into Upper North Arm, where we know there have been historical quite large changes in water quality, and where water quality continues to be a pretty limiting factor for things like seagrasses. Sedimentation, there are 2 components to that. So we're monitoring sedimentation in subtidal areas. That's at 4 of the fixed site water quality monitoring stations, but also at the edge of the mangroves throughout Lower North Arm and then up into Upper North Arm. The subtidal sites are really looking at the amount of sediment that's moving through that system, and that's documenting that, you know, in areas with high current, there's a lot more sediment moving around and it tends to be coarser. In the lower current areas, there's less sediment moving around, and it's quite a lot finer. The mangrove sedimentation program is showing pretty low rates of sediment, you know, accretion at the mangroves, and quite a lot of variability. So it's up and down. For those of you who've spent a bit of time on Western Port in the last couple of years, these are you might have seen some of these buoys, little yellow buoys with solar panels on them. The buoy itself has the data logger. It transmits the data via the mobile phone network back to ourselves, so we can see all the data in real time. The instruments themselves are down near the seabed, and they're monitoring primarily light and turbidity, but also depth, so we can see the tidal variations, temperature and salinity. But it's really the light data and the turbidity data that will inform our description of the existing conditions in Western Port, but also provide a basis for ongoing monitoring should the project go ahead. Typically, dredging programs require some form of monitoring to ensure that, you know, you're staying within the limits that have been committed to. Thanks, Liam. The other part of the water quality monitoring program is mobile water quality sampling. And this sampling has really matched the sampling that's been done by EPA over a long period of time. So a similar suite of parameters and essentially the same methods. So each time the boat goes out, the team is sampling nutrients, metals, and a whole lot of parameters through the water column, including light, turbidity, temperature, pH, oxygen or dissolved oxygen levels, and salinity. And we also collect samples near the surface and down the bottom for analysis of total suspended solids. And that's a key bit of information we need to inform the modelling of dredge plumes. One thing to note is that the length of the program, 18 months and 20 surveys, is sort of well in excess of what would normally be required based on the guidelines for a project that's describing background water quality conditions. Another big part of the work we're doing, and this is a habitat map that's completed last year, is mapping the habitats that in the near vicinity of the terminal project, so that we can understand, what habitats and in what quantities are going to be affected. So there's obviously reclamation, and that'll be a loss of habitats in that area, and then dredging, which removes the surface of the existing habitat, but what's left after dredging can be recolonized, so it's a modified deeper habitat. The intertidal area near the project was mapped based on aerial photography we collected with drones, and then a towed underwater camera survey was used to collect the data we needed to come up with this habitat map. So see all the little black dots over the map, they're the tracks from the camera tows. All that information went into a machine learning model, taking in a whole lot of other information as well, including bathymetry and a whole lot of information you can get out of the bathymetry data we have for Western Port, but also things like current speed. One thing to note is that while there's been lots of work on seagrass mapping and mangroves and salt marsh around Western Port, the deeper channels are mapped in a pretty coarse way. So this is one of the first times we've had a really good understanding of how habitats differ depth and with different types of seabed. Thanks, Liam. We've also been monitoring seagrasses. So seagrasses are sensitive to turbidity, because turbidity that's generated by dredge plumes reduces the light that's available for photosynthesis by seagrasses. There's two parts to it. So Western Port is known for having really extensive seagrass meadows, and they're sort of roughly split into those that are in the intertidal zone, so on the mudflats that dry out at low tide, and the subtidal seagrasses, which grow along the banks of the channel in shallow water, generally down to sort of 4 to 5 and up to 6 metres in places. We've needed two different methods. Intertidal area, we used drones, so aerial photography, to collect information there, and then the subtidal area, we're using towed cameras, so the same equipment we used for the habitat mapping. Results at this point, that for subtidal areas, we were really interested in the depth limits of the seagrasses and how they compare to historical depth limits of the seagrass, and that's to understand both as a baseline for impact assessment. If light's reduced, that the depth limit of the seagrass might reduce, so they'll become shallower. But also we're looking at things like the macroalgae. Seagrass meadows support quite a lot of macroalgae which grow on the seagrass, and they're also an important part of the ecosystem. They also photosynthesize, so they might be affected by dredge plumes. In the intertidal area, again, potentially affected by reduced light due to dredge plumes, but also sedimentation as the turbidity settles out. The intertidal surveys found seagrass present all year round. Some areas had quite significant seasonal variations in the cover, whereas others are much less. The other big part of our studies is the marine invertebrate studies. So there's two broad groups of marine invertebrates. It's those that live in the sediment, the infauna, and then those that are near the sediment surface. The infauna studies used grab sampling. So there's a photo there of the Smith-McIntyre grab that was used. It's the same equipment that was used back in the 70s when the infauna in Western Port was studied in the first place. It works really well in Western Port. The sediments tend to be really mixed. There's a lot of shell, gravel in it. Some areas have seagrass, which you need quite a powerful grab to get through. And some areas are just sandy. So it's able to work in all of them and return really good samples that we then take and we sieve, and all those animals go off to a specialist laboratory for them to count all the worms and molluscs and crustaceans that are there and identify them. We also looked at spatial and seasonal variation in the epifauna community, and we included algae with that, so epibiota. And that was to again, a potentially sensitive receptor, both the infauna and the epifauna. Many of them rely on filter feeding or deposit feeding, so it might be affected by turbid plumes. So this is really getting an understanding of what's the distribution of different species, what's the sort of existing variation between seasons and sites. And that's to help. I mentioned getting doing quite a lot of statistical analysis. So we needed some data to inform any sort of future monitoring program that could be used to assess impacts. Thanks, Liam. Yeah, thank you. The other study is on fish. So we're supported by the University of Melbourne on this. There are three different parts to this program. Sorry, Liam, is it not playing properly? Or? Great, thank you. So this video just shows some of the footage that was collected, and there's tags on all the fish showing you what they are. So there's baited video surveys, but we also used seine netting. So that's with a hand-pulled, very fine mesh seine net to capture the species that live down in amongst the seagrass and are too small to see on the camera, or just don't come out of the seagrass. And then also baited traps, and that data was used to look at the size of fish, and it caught a slightly different range of fish. These studies showed some pretty interesting seasonal variations, perhaps not all that surprising. The lowest number of species was winter, and then that increased through spring and autumn, and that's sort of what you'd expect, both with some species move in and out of Western Port over the year, and there's also waves of recruitment of new fish through the year. The seine nets caught the highest number of species and also the highest number of individuals in spring. And this is sort of consistent with recruitment of young fish, mostly occurring in spring. There are some pretty significant differences between depths, unsurprisingly, because there are also differences in habitat with depth. But for the 5 sites that were through Lower North Arm, from down near Woolies Beach right up towards Quail Island, there wasn't much difference over that area. This slide sets out some of the other marine ecological values of Western Port. So we've been pretty focused on the key components of the Ramsar site, but there are several other species that are matters of national environmental significance. That includes a whole range of marine mammals, so humpbacks, southern right whales, dolphins are another group of cetaceans that fall under the EPBC Act. Australian fur seals, not a matter of national environmental significance, but lots of them live and utilise Western Port. And then the one exception to the birds that we are looking at is the penguins, and they're present in North Arm year round. It's obviously big colonies on Phillip Island, and then a very small one up at the top of near the top of French Island. For large whales, and for some of the other marine fauna, no, that's okay, Liam. You can go forward to the underwater noise. It was important to collect information on the existing levels of underwater noise in Western Port. This is something that hasn't been done much. There has been a little bit done, I know, over in East Arm. But in North Arm, there's very little understanding of what existing underwater noise levels are like. So underwater noise is essentially all the noise that comes from the weather. The fauna themselves, so fish and shrimp, generate quite a bit of noise, but also the existing vessel traffic. So there's a lot of recreational vessel traffic in Western Port, as well as the commercial operations of the port. So this data gives us the context to interpret modelling results relating to piling and dredging. So both those things have been, the underwater noise generated by marine piling and from dredging have both been modelled to inform the preliminary impact assessment. Thanks, Liam. So for marine ecology, there's a number of key pathways we had to consider in the preliminary impact assessment. It was a preliminary impact assessment, so we couldn't go right into it. It was for the referral. So there's quite a bit of work we're still doing to understand potential impacts. But the key pathways are really the dredge-induced sediment plumes. And I've spoken a bit about the ways they might interact with the ecosystem. It's primarily the turbidity effect on the light climate, but also sedimentation. One thing to note is there has been a lot of there's been an assessment of the sediments at the site for contamination. That's consistent with any plan to do dredging, and the sediments are considered clean under the assessment guidelines. So they will all be reused in the reclamation, and they'll be safe to use for that. and any dredge plumes will not be redistributing harmful levels of contaminants. The other key things, particularly with regards to the Ramsar site, is the dredging and reclamation activity themselves. So there will be a loss of a small area of habitat in the reclamation, and then the dredging and the construction of the quay wall will modify habitats, and the quay wall and the scale protection in particular will introduce new hard substrate habitat, which is not all that abundant in Western Port at the moment. There's the underwater noise we spoke about earlier. You saw all the piling that has to occur, but also, putting a structure in the marine environment and changing the depths has potential to impact on hydrodynamics, and that may have flow-on effects on coastal processes, and so they've been assessed as well. Lower risk pathways are largely things that are activities that already occur in Western Port, and we have existing management arrangements that prevent those causing harm to the environment. They will be assessed, but at this stage of the project, they were assessed at quite a high level. So the findings of the preliminary impact assessment are set out here pretty briefly. So there's no direct loss of salt marsh, and we're certainly not expecting any effects on salt marsh from turbid plumes. There's localised loss of intertidal mudflats and seagrasses as a result of the reclamation. You can see the figure for the area there. Nevertheless, that is a significant impact that the project needs to consider. Turbid plumes will affect water quality during dredging. Nevertheless, the turbidity levels are expected to return to background levels within weeks, possibly up to around a month after dredging ceases. So that's all been modelled. Sedimentation levels are really quite low. They're levels that would be, in reality, quite hard to measure in the field, and largely because they're within existing naturally occurring levels, and certainly levels that seagrasses have been shown to be able to tolerate. The water quality monitoring and adaptive management measures during dredging are expected to minimise any potential adverse impacts to seagrasses, and we're not expecting any significant impacts on migratory, endangered and vulnerable EPBC Act listed marine species. The underwater noise from piling, the modelling shows that there's potential for that to impact fish and marine mammals, but there are known, well-established standard mitigation measures that can be implemented to prevent significant effects from underwater noise. And if you do want to have a look, there are some preliminary mitigation and monitoring measures in the preliminary impact assessment report. Our work's not entirely complete. We still have a bit more happening. We're still out there completing some of the surveys and assessing the data. Be able to flick to the next slide, sorry there. So one of the things that regulators ask us to do is to come up with assessment criteria for the impact assessment, and so that's essentially the criteria that we assess things against to make it clear for everyone to understand what the impacts are going to be. There's a large study happening on seagrass light thresholds at the moment, and combined with all the water quality and light monitoring data, that'll be used to both inform the impact assessment, but also design any ongoing monitoring program that would be required. We're looking at food resources for wading birds in the mudflats. We're working closely with Biosis to develop that. The light thresholds and turbidity thresholds, they'll come out of the water quality data that we're collecting and now analysing. And then I showed that habitat map that's sort of focused on the project area. We've since completed surveys so that we can map habitats over the entirety of the Western Port Ramsar site. And then I mentioned a preliminary impact assessment couldn't or didn't go into detail in some of those lower risk impact pathways, but those will be interrogated and assessed fully in the full impact assessment. So thank you. That's it for marine ecology. I'll hand over to Claire and Omeric from Biosis.
Thanks, Pete. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Tingate. I'm a senior zoologist working at Biosis. I've been working on the project since we commenced doing some survey work in 2023. And my colleague, Principal Zoologist Mark Venosta, is leading the project at Biosis. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight to present, so I'm myself and my colleague Omeric are presenting on behalf of him. And he's been working for over 25 years in the industry, leading big scale sort of similar impact assessment work. Thanks, Liam. So I'll just start off with some quick definitions for the project. So we're using the term waterbirds here to encompass all bird species that are wholly or substantially reliant on the waters of Western Port. And within that, you might hear us talking a bit about shorebirds. So these are the small to medium-sized wading birds that feed mainly from those shallow water margins around the intertidal areas of wetlands, and seabirds, so birds that primarily rely on those open water, open ocean habitats and forage partially or wholly out at sea. And then we might also talk about some coastal species, so birds like gulls and terns that frequent those inshore benthic environments. So we'll move on to some of our study aims. So what we're looking at for the project. We are aiming to understand the habitats that exist both within and surrounding the terminal project area. And we are primarily recording waterbirds using those habitats. And documenting the relative diversity and abundance of waterbirds in those areas. A part of our work, we're also looking at breeding activity of resident waterbird species for those local Australian breeding species, so things like terns, oyster catchers, swans and plovers. We are documenting the baseline data of seabird activity in Western Port to contribute to that baseline understanding of seabirds within and around Western Port. We're looking at some nighttime foraging and roosting behaviours of waterbirds both within the terminal project area and surrounding locations. And then finally, we are doing a tracking study to look at the key waterbird species and provide some high resolution data on the movement and behavioural patterns to complement the other work that we're doing. And all of this is being used to inform the impact assessment as the project progresses. So I'll touch a bit on the methodologies of what we're doing. I guess one good thing about Western Port is that it does have a really great foundational data, and we do have a really good understanding of waterbird use in Western Port. Surveys that have been going on since the 1970s by BirdLife Australia and other groups provide us with a really good understanding of what the waterbird activity and abundance is like. So our work is just looking to contribute to that baseline understanding. So like I mentioned, we are undertaking a range of studies over a 2-year survey program to collect data and document the current distribution and abundance of waterbird species. So these include the waterbird abundance and diversity surveys, some nocturnal work, some seabird work, looking at breeding activity, and then the waterbird tracking study. And a key component of our survey program is those abundance and diversity surveys, and they involve 2 replicate surveys each season where we're doing some broad sort of systematic boat-based counts at both high tide and low tide, looking at foraging and roosting behaviours of waterbirds. So now we can have a look at the map. I guess one thing to take note of is those areas in the red polygons, which are showing the locations for the abundance and diversity surveys. So it's extending up around Warneen, Blind Bight in the north, and then down to Stony Point and that western shoreline of French Island in the south. And these surveys and survey areas have been designed based on the potential extent of impacts and are consistent with the current survey guidelines and methodologies. The other thing to take note of in this map is you can see the seabird survey transects, where we're undertaking the boat-based surveys up in the North Arm, extending up to Warneen in the north, and then down and around to the Nobbies and Flinders in the south. So traversing those deeper channels where we're more likely to get some seabird activity in the south. Thanks, Liam. So I'll touch now on a bit of our findings from the survey work so far. So as we know, the Western Port Ramsar site provides really important habitat for a diversity of both the resident and migratory waterbird species. So those migratory species that are breeding up in the Northern Hemisphere, and then they're coming down to the Southern Hemisphere and spending time in Australia during the non-breeding season. And Western Port does provide really particularly important foraging resources for those birds when they're here, and allowing them to bulk up before they depart back north on migration. So some of our survey work so far has identified some key roosting and foraging habitat for significant species, including the redneck stints. So the smallest migratory shorebird species, you can see an example of a flock of those birds in the photo on the slide there. And then some other important migratory species like eastern curlews, common greenshank, and bar-tailed godwit. So from what we've been finding so far, our results have been largely consistent with the current understanding of waterbird use in Western Port and the previously identified important sites for birds. This includes roost sites along the western shoreline of French Island, around the northwest corner of French Island as well. We've also identified that the Western Port Marina breakwater in Hastings Bight provides a really important roost site for the redneck stints, and they seem to be quite regularly using that spot at high tide. And then we've been documenting the eastern curlews roosting down at Tortoise Head in that southwest corner of French Island as well. We also know that the Middle Spit provides a really extensive area of intertidal mudflats which are exposed at low tides, where we get a lot of waterbird activity, and it clearly provides a really important foraging site for many species. So you can see some examples of what I've just been talking about in these photos here. So we've got some eastern curlews roosting at Tortoise Head in the top left-hand corner there. We've got the Western Port Marina breakwater at high tide. You can see what look like tiny little grey dots all along the rocky breakwater there, where all the boats are moored and coming in and out. We've got some cormorants hanging out on Middle Spit, and then we've got a flock of small shorebirds along the western shoreline of French Island as well. So moving on to what we found at the terminal project area. So waterbird habitat at the terminal project area consists of a small saltmarsh wetland on the inland component, and then there is a intertidal zone with a narrow sandy rocky shoreline, and then some mangroves that extend to the south of the OTRA site as well. So as we've already discussed in a bit of the background, the OTRA site were formed through modification and land reclamation. And due to this, what exists now is an extended shoreline that's sort of moved west into Western Port. So the mudflats that are exposed at low tide are relatively narrow compared to what exists to the north and the south of the site, and in surrounding areas of Western Port as well. So in terms of waterbird activity at the site, we've documented some threatened listed tern species that have been flying overhead through the area, and we've also got some threatened egrets that will forage around BlueScope and Esso jetty, particularly at low tide. We've also documented some fledgling short tail shearwaters flying offshore during autumn, and our surveys haven't recorded any migratory shorebird use of the terminal project area. The nearest site to support migratory shorebirds is the Long Island Spit. So I think I had that on my previous slide, but it's approximately 1 kilometre south of the OTRA site, and the Spit was formed by dredging in, I think it was in the 1980s, and that sort of changed in shape over time, but it does provide a roost site for migratory shorebirds at high tide, and then the Spit that extends south into Hastings Bight is also provides foraging habitat at low tide. Thanks, Liam. So this slide just summarises the key values that have been identified for impact assessments for waterbirds, and each potential impact pathway were identified during the risk assessment process as a part of the EES. So a key risk to waterbirds relates to the possible trophic impacts on the Ramsar site more broadly, and the potential to impact waterbird resources and habitat, things like that Pete's touched on in the marine ecology, including aquatic fauna, seagrass, mangroves, and salt marsh. We're also looking at the potential impacts through changes in habitat or the abundance and distribution of prey resources from altered hydrodynamics or sedimentation, and then the potential impacts as well from the direct loss of habitat from the reclamation are also being considered, as well as things like impacts from noise, lighting, spills, and invasive weeds during both construction and operation of the terminal. Thanks, Liam. So just to touch on some of the findings from our preliminary impact assessment. So our preliminary findings have suggested that the habitat loss and disturbance from the construction activities and the dredging and reclamation are unlikely to have a significant direct effect on waterbirds. Our current findings are indicating that the bird abundance in the immediate area is low compared to richer intertidal zones elsewhere in Western Port. Our preliminary findings have also relied on the determinations from the marine ecology and coastal processes assessments that the impacts will be localised and not result in broader impacts to the ecological character of the site. So as Pete also mentioned with marine ecology, we're also completing a lot of our final survey work for the program to ensure we have a really robust understanding of waterbird activity in the area. Our assessments will be then progressing to integrate further technical findings and detailed assessments from other studies as well, for coastal processes, marine ecology, to determine the final impacts, as well as assessing any cumulative impacts and developing mitigation measures. I will now pass over to my colleague, Aymeric, who will talk to you a little bit more about the waterbirds tracking study that we're also undertaking.
Thank you, Claire. So my name is Aymeric Froment. I have been working on tracking wildlife for more than 10 years now. I did my PhD at Deakin University working on seabirds in Bass Strait, and I've been focusing on waterbirds and marine mammals in southeastern Australia for more than 8 years now. I'm going to present you here a quick presentation on what is the tracking survey and how we use that as a complementary information for what has been done and what is currently being done with more traditional methods. The main reason why we do tracking for birds, it's because when we do traditional methods like Claire just presented, There is one key aspect that we are missing. It's the fact that we don't have any information about the movement of the birds at the individual level and population level. So the main objectives for the tracking survey, like I mentioned, understanding more the movements of the birds, also getting more detailed information about what do they do during the day, but more importantly, also knowing what they do at night, because even if we do nocturnal survey, it's difficult to understand how they move around at night. And using all this data, we accumulate a lot of location, and from that we can try to do habitat modeling. So we work on 5 species. Here, the 4 species that I'm showing there are species that were selected to represent different type of behavior. So on the top, we have on the left the pied oystercatcher and the redneck stint. These 2 species are shorebirds, and there's the pied oystercatcher is a medium size, the stint is a small size. The pied oystercatcher is resident, the stint is migratory. So that's our objective with this species, is to try to capture as much information as possible, knowing that it's not possible logistically and on an ethical point of view to try to catch all the species that we could, knowing that more than 100 species have been recorded in Western Port. The 3rd species is the black swan. So the black swan are very interesting because they are herbivores, so they mostly feed on the seagrass beds. And then the last species, or the 4th species, is the crested tern, who is piscivorous, so mostly focusing or foraging on fish and larvae. So for these 4 species, the main objective is to understand their roosting behavior and their foraging behavior. And there is a 5th species, the short-tailed shearwater. We know already that they don't forage in Western Port, and they don't really have any roosting site in the area, because their main habitat is offshore. But there is a few colonies on French Island. There is big colonies on Phillip Island, and there are 2 colonies on French Islands, one near Tankerton and one on Turtle's Head. And for this species, the main interest is to understand how do they move between the colony and their offshore habitat, knowing that they only come back at night. There are some records of shearwaters during the day, but it's very limited in terms of records. So for the shearwaters, we focus on 2 aspects. We track adults, and we also track fledgling. So it's what we have been doing so far. So this map presents where we are working on all these species, and in yellow it's the 2 colonies that I was talking about the short-tailed shearwaters. For the swans, we try to capture birds in different places within the western arm of Western Port. And for oystercatchers and redneck we work on the mainland near Hastings and also on French Island. in Turtle's Head, Fairhaven, and Barrier Island. And Crested Tern, we started to work on the Nobis, which is the main colony in the region on Phillip Island. So I won't talk about all the species because we don't have too much time, but I'm going to give you an example about how we capture this species with the pied oystercatcher. So we use decoys that we made of papier-mâché, and it looks very simple and kind of ugly. But so these two decoys are called Mr. Squiggle and Mrs. Squiggle, and they are used to attract the oyster catchers on roosting sites. And I don't know if you can see on this image, we use noose mats that are hidden in the sands, and it's just nooses with made of fishing line. And as soon as a bird gets caught, we capture it and then deploy a device. Why do we do that? It's because we want to capture a small number of individuals, which is 15, and we don't want to capture them all at one time. So this kind of methods is a good way to do what we call targeted surveys that are more ethical than using other technique where we catch a lot of birds, and it allows us to work at different sites very easily as well. So the device we use are miniaturized GPS devices. For in the photo on the left, that's the device we use on the oyster catchers and the crested terns. We can use different ways to attach the device, but usually it's just taped around 4 or 5 back feathers, and it's good enough to hold for a few weeks at least. And this device, they transmit data to antennas that we deployed on different sites around Western Port, and then we receive this data directly. This is an example of how the attachment looks like on pied oystercatcher. And just for your information, why do we wear this mask, gloves, and it looks like we look like butchers? It's in prevention of the bird flu, which has not been detected in Australia. It's a specific type of bird flu. It's different to what you probably heard in the media about the egg shortage. And so far it hasn't been detected, but we need to work with this kind of PPE to both protect us, but also avoid to transmit any kind of disease from one bird to another if they were sick. The last photo is a redneck stint with the device. This device is different to what you can see on the left photo. It's even smaller. It's just 1 gram. They don't aim to work for as long as the first device, and they are just glued on the lower back. And with this kind of device, usually we expect to collect data for maybe a week, 2, if it's working for long enough. And after this short period, the device just falls off. So, like I said, I won't be able to present you information for all the species, also because this data is currently being analyzed as well. So I'm just going to present the tracking data we have been collecting for the redneck stints. It looks a bit messy when we're present there, but what you see is each color is one individual. So we collected data with 14 individuals so far. And there are different layers of information to get from there. The first one is the fact that they are very mobile. They move all the time between roosting sites and foraging sites. There is an overall pattern that we can see at the population level, but also each individual have their own strategy. With this data set, we had clear information about which site was the main roosting sites, at least during the study period, which sites were the main foraging sites. For the redneck stints, it's definitely Middle Spit in Western Port, and there is also the south of Long Island that is important, and near Barrier Island in the northwest corner of French Island. The other information that was not expected for this tiny bird, it's the fact that every night they travel all the way to the Eastern Treatment Plant, which is more than 25 kilometers away from Western Port. And they all have the same pattern. They leave at 10 p.m., stay there for 4 to 6 hours, and then come back to Western Port before sunrise. The main reason, the main theory why they do that, it's the fact that they are going there to find a reliable roosting site at night to avoid predation on any other kind of roosting sites in or around Western Port. And this information is very interesting because it shows how, first, like I mentioned, redneck stints are very mobile. Also, that they navigate within a urban or suburban environment very easily, where there are lights, there are highways, there are transmission lines, and that is part of their environment. And also it shows how stints, but it's true for a lot of species of shorebirds, how artificial wetlands and especially treatment plants are important for this kind of species. So I'm not going to present other results tonight, but if you have any questions, I can definitely reply on about this question. And I also forgot to mention that these tracking results, they provide us probably for each season we're collecting something like 150,000 locations, and they are very, very helpful because we have these locations. They are very precise. It's like the accuracy is something like less than 2 meters. So combined with what Claire presented and what Peter presented about the different habitat, all of that together provide a clear information on the whole ecosystem of Western Port. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire and Amaric, and thank you to all our speakers tonight for your presentations. I hope everyone got something out of what has been shared. I have seen you've all been very busy in the chat asking questions. Thank you for that. So we've got them all queued, and I will also be revisiting a number of marine-related questions that were raised or put forward at our last webinar for a response from our marine ecologist, Peter Cocker. We have about 30 minutes now to get through as many questions as we can. We may go over a little bit because we do want to answer as many as possible. So to get us started, I want to bring up Peter Watt, please. Peter, we've got a question here. With the changes to the modified terminal facility, will it still be a viable financial business proposition?
Good. Thanks, Lyndall. Yeah, it's a good question. So with the significant reduction in terms of the dredging footprint and also the reclamation footprint, is that going to affect what we can actually handle at the terminal? So it will have small impact on the operability of the terminal, but the reasons why it won't have a significant impact is because we've got a much better understanding now of the bathymetry, so the seabed levels, compared to what we had with the original 2023 EPBC referral. We've also done a detailed, it's called a discrete event simulation, but more commonly known as a time in motion study. So it's quite a sophisticated bit of computer analysis so that we can look at the water. We can look at the operations of the vessels coming in and out of the terminal. And so what we've managed to do is actually decrease the depth of, say, the approach channel, which means that the ships can't come in at all states of the tide, so they can't come in at the lowest of low tides. So it does impact a little bit on the operability, but it does give quite a big advantage in terms of reduction of the dredging footprint and the dredging volume. However, the discrete event simulation has shown that we will get the throughput for the terminal with what we originally planned to do and what the government requirements has set us to do. So it's still very much a viable business operation.
Thanks, Peter. I'll stay with you for another question. Do the contractors for the proposed VRET project have international experience building similar onshore terminals with quay walls and dredging in a Ramsar site?
So thanks again, Lyndall. So we haven't nominated a build contractor for the project as yet. There'll be a process next year where we start eliciting sort of responses from the contracting market. But clearly that experience of building in sensitive environmental environments, sensitive environments, and also expertise in building these sort of large infrastructure or heavy duty scale infrastructure marine facilities will definitely be, highly regarded. And look, we definitely see there'll be a mix of both Australian and international contractors that would be interested and capable of doing the works.
Fabulous. And Peter, staying with you again as well, another design related question. How will predicted sea level rises by 2070 in Western Port impact on the proposed project, especially during more frequent and severe storms and high tides?
Yeah, good. So the design of the terminal will accommodate that sea level rise. I don't have the exact figures to hand, but I believe by 2100 they're predicting it might be a 700 or 800 millimetre sea level rise. So we will design the height of the terminal so it won't be inundated with water during either high tides, and the stormwater drainage system will also be designed to cover those heavy intensity rainfall events which are predicted. And yeah, look, you're spot on. Certainly what we expect to get in the future will be much higher higher sea levels and more intense rainfall.
Thanks, Peter. Peter Cocker, we've had questions from a number of questions in relation to the presence of substances and contaminants in the soils and waters of Western Port from previous activities in the region. Are there any harmful substances in the soil that will be dredged to deepen the shipping or the ship berthing area? And if so, what are they?
Okay, thank you. The assessments done to date have sampled the sediments through the full depth profile that will be dredged, and those assessments take those samples. So they're long cores of sediment, and sample at different depths to identify if there's any contamination in it. I touched on it in my presentation. The levels of contaminants there, so heavy metals, organics, and other things, were all below the limits set out in the guidelines. So it doesn't mean that they're not there, they're just within acceptable limits for use of this dredge spoil in reclamation, or there's no marine disposal of this dredge spoil, but that would be within the limits for marine disposal of dredge spoil. What was documented is there's some naturally occurring metals, particularly arsenic, and that's quite common in Southeast Australia. It naturally occurs geologically. So I suppose those results indicate that, because the sampling is sort of in the middle of the active port area, that there isn't potentially harmful levels of contaminants there. Further afield, this project hasn't assessed contamination levels in areas beyond the terminal project area. There has been quite a bit of work by Melbourne Water further afield, which does show that the catchment contributes contaminant loads, and those tend to be localised around the rivers and streams, and so it comes through the stormwater.
Thanks, Peter. Just staying on this point though, now, and I do note that you just mentioned a number of heavy metal contaminants, but there's a question in relation to historical shipping operations and whether any heavy metal contaminants have been found in relation to that, particularly in seagrass beds around Western Port, and what effect will the presence of potentially, if those substances exist, have on marine and bird life?
Look, the short answer is they haven't been assessed, and that is largely because so there are both the facilities at Long Island Point and at BlueScope Steel. They have wastewater discharges that are licensed by the Environment Protection Authority, and they have management commitments in terms of the quality of water that's discharged and monitoring as well. I'm not aware of any issues with contamination of seagrasses from those, and EPA does regulate these operators and would look into it. You would think if there was an issue. In terms of so I suppose the answer is not that we know of.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Watt, I'll also call on you now. It does relate to this. It relates to dredging. There's a question here. I believe dredging will initially go for 24 hours a day for 8 months. Are you saying this will not affect Western Port?
No, we're not saying that. So, yeah, the dredging operations absolutely will have an impact. This project is not a zero impact project. We do the reclamation, we do the dredging. However, the preliminary impact assessments that have been completed are showing that those impacts are small and localised. And the important thing is that it won't have an impact on, or it won't have an unacceptable impact on the ecological character of the Ramsar wetland. So, yeah, absolutely, there will be turbidity plumes. There will be a bit of sediment settling out of the water column with that turbidity. But again, we're not seeing, it's that small and localised, and looking at the overall wetland doesn't have an unacceptable impact.
Could you please share the expected construction timeline, considering that the 2 gigawatt is targeted for delivery by 2032?
Yeah, so we're looking at around 2.5 to 3 years for the construction of the complete facility, and there's likely to be a staged opening of the terminal. So the first berth, when that is complete and a certain amount of backup land, then that could be open to receive the first vessels. prior to completion of the overall terminal.
Thanks, Peter. Peter Crockett, I need to call you back up. In terms of our last webinar, we had several marine-related questions that we took on notice. So I'd just like to revisit these. You touched on fish in your presentation. What studies are planned or have been done to investigate the project's impact on fish in general? And are there any fish breeding structures introduced for fish breeding habitats?
Thank you. It's a good question. So in 2023, we completed, and into 2024, a year of studies on fish. So the surveys in each season, that baited video, baited traps, also seine netting. That information was used to identify what species are there, including if there are any threatened species inhabiting those habitats. What sort of, I suppose, are the commercially or recreationally significant species might be present, and how those species are distributed, which habitats for which species. That information will be used in the impact assessment to inform, how we do the assessment, particularly with regards to things like the turbid plumes. There's potential for turbid plumes to interfere with particularly fish gills, their breathing structure, but also things like, for visual, most fish are visual hunters or grazers, if it will affect their ability to capture their food. Sediments also, suspended sediments might also be a stressor for fish larvae and fish eggs. So again, we use that information to track down what we need to understand about their sensitivity. And then the other one, again, we're looking at underwater noise. So we use the information we collect on the species that are present to understand whether we need to be concerned about underwater noise levels and how they might be mitigated. Yep. Fish breeding structures. There's, at this stage of the project, there's no plan to deliberately introduce fish breeding structures. What will happen is, the construction of that quay wall, which is a steel piled structure with some concrete as well. There are some other structures, the mooring dolphins, which are off the end of the quay wall. They're piled structures. And then there's the stone bed and scour protection placed at the bottom of the berth pocket. So those are hard substrates, which in Western Port we know get positively festooned with marine invertebrates and become quite interesting habitat.
Thanks, Peter. I have another question from the previous webinar, and also this is for you and Natasha. I would like to get your response to this as well, because it does relate to the EPBC referral. What impact will the construction and operation have on marine life and marine habitats? Will this include any habitat destruction, noise pollution, or changes in water quality?
I'll jump in first. So
yep.
I think that the project's been quite clear that there will be certain impacts associated with the project. We know that there's some loss of habitat due to the reclamation and modification of habitat. The modification is something that we need to consider further. In that dredged area, it will recover, but it will be different species or different groups of species living there. Noise pollution. So during construction, there's obviously noise associated with the construction activities, and when there's operation, the ships coming and going generate noise. Again, the assessment will need to look at the levels of shipping and the monitoring of the existing conditions. Will be able to provide some really clear answers on expectations around an increase or otherwise of underwater noise. Changes in water quality, those are expected to be temporary, and there's high confidence that any change in water quality would be temporary, and that's associated with the dredging program, which for the preferred option is a 4.8-month dredging program. Some of those water quality impacts, and it's primarily turbidity, will persist for a number of weeks once dredging is complete, but then water quality will recover.
Thanks, Peter. Natasha, did you want to provide any additional comments?
I think Peter's covered it really well, Lyndall. I just highlight that our referral and the suite of information in our referral provides a really comprehensive assessment on these matters that you can go to and read. And there's a document that gives you a summary of the findings thus far. So if you're after some more detailed information, I'd direct anyone interested in that to the referral documents.
Thanks, Natasha. Can I stay with you now? We have a question in relation to sort of financial bonds for the project. So will the Port of Hastings or the Victorian Government provide an environmental or rehabilitation financial bond in the case of a worst case scenario or damage or of damage to Western Port?
Yeah, okay. So firstly, the foundation is if the work we are doing identifies that there's likely to be a significant impact on the environment, the project won't be approved. So I don't see that as being a high risk. The state and federal government would be remiss to approve a project that had a high likelihood of risk to the environment. I will go on to say that through the work that we're doing, there will be impacts, and we need to prove to both the state and federal government that we have processes in place to manage and mitigate those impacts appropriately. And we bring in things like real-time monitoring potentially of our impacts as we go through construction. So I wouldn't expect impacts to get to a stage where there is some sort of impact that was not foreseen. But I will say also that any potential bond would be the decision of the Victorian Government, but I haven't seen that sort of imposed on a project before.
Yep. Staying on issues of mitigation with you, Natasha, and I'll also call up Claire and Peter Crockett again. What if we can't mitigate a problem? What will we be able to do? This relates particularly to marine ecology, waterbirds, and also the Ramsar impacts.
Okay, I might just start from a general perspective, and then Claire and Peter can answer more in their subject as the subject matter experts. So, as part of the ES, if we do these studies and we come up with an impact that is unavoidable, we need to explain why it's unavoidable. We need to also explain the alternatives that we've looked at that demonstrate that we've had a really robust assessment to come to that conclusion. And then if there are residual impacts, we need to come away with a process whereby we can monitor and manage those impacts appropriately. So there will be issues that cannot be entirely mitigated with any project. And it's just really about the processes and the measures in place to manage those. I'll throw to Peter and Claire for any further commentary.
Thanks, Natasha. I think you've covered it well. The only thing I would add is that the impact assessment process is really iterative. And so when you get to a point where you're concerned about impacts, that you do go back around and look at the project, and that's already happened with this new referral, and it will continue to happen as the project develops. But yeah, if There will be residual impacts. It's about assessing, whether they're significant, doing as much mitigation as possible, and then testing that with regulators and the government. I'll let Claire add anything on birds.
Yeah, I don't have anything too much more specific to add at this point, other than, yeah, we will be looking at mitigations as the project progresses, and like we've said, it's about flagging where the issues come up as we go, and like having that conversation with the regulators. And we've also talked a bit about, I guess, the potential for the offset plan, and that's getting developed at the moment as well. So that's sort of the final component in this as well.
Thanks. Thank you all. Now, I do actually want to move to Chantelle. Chantelle Steele is the Port's Environment Environment Manager. Hi, Chantelle. Now, we are getting close to time as well, so I just want to acknowledge we will try and get through as many questions as we can. We may go over a little bit, but hi, Chantelle. Will underwater or LiDAR footage of the proposed dredging area be made available to the public to see the current state of the Western Port seabed? Would this be made through the EPBC attachments, for example?
Thanks, Lyndall. So just to clarify, and maybe Peter jump in if I'm incorrect, but as far as I am aware, we haven't collected any LiDAR data. The underwater towed camera data that has definitely been collected is not available in terms of a video or anything like that, like the fish video as part of the EPBC referral, and I would doubt that it would be accompanying the EES technical reports that would be put on public exhibition. What we probably could look maybe to do is put something like that fish video together with a few snapshots to give people an idea of what's existing down there at the moment.
Thanks, Chantelle. We have another question in relation to the Ramsar information sheet that is sort of managed or developed by the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, so DECA. Will this department be updating the Ramsar information sheet for Western Port? It was last updated in May 1999. It seems to be overdue. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's well overdue. I can confirm though, at the end of last month, it was published, an updated version of the RIS was published on the Commonwealth's website, environment.gov.au. It's just a draft at this point. They're awaiting endorsement from the convention, and once that happens, it will be updated when approved by the Secretariat. Maybe we can share the link, Lyndall, in the chat, or
that's a good idea.
Via email to the attendees tomorrow or something.
Yep, I think let's commit to sending it around to all the attendees.
Sure.
Thanks. Natasha, I have a question. It does sort of relate to Waterbirds, but I think you are best placed to answer this. Is there any independent report that verifies that our claims that the terminal facility will not interfere with waterbirds or their habitats?
There will definitely be an independent review. So as part of the EES process, the Impact Assessment Unit of DTP, Department of Planning, they have engaged a group called the Independent Expert Group for our EES. And these are independent specialists that will be reviewing this information and providing their independent view on the reports. And also through the panel process, the panel's independent and they're appointed by the Minister for Planning. So they will undertake their independent assessment of all of the studies and the conclusions.
Natasha, I'll stay with you. Who determines what is a significant impact? It's such a subjective assessment. Are you able to provide comment on that?
I can, Lyndall. So there's different definitions of significant impact. There's the Commonwealth definition of significant impact. So when they're considering our referral and our assessment, they will use that definition under their Act to make a conclusion as to whether our project has a significant impact. That definition isn't such for the Victorian process, but it is a widely used definition.
Thank you, Natasha. And I do have a couple of last questions. They are directed to Peter Watt, our project director. Peter, I'm just going to ask you a quick question about ships. How are the ships fueled, and where does that occur?
So there are two main types of vessels. One is the delivery vessels, which are bringing the turbine components from overseas manufacturing locations. So often the refueling, or sometimes we call it bunkering, will be done at the overseas port as opposed to in Western Port. So currently there's no bunkering or refueling vessels that happen in Western Port, except for some of the smaller vessels such as the tugboats and oil spill response vessel. In terms of the offshore installation vessel, which is transiting between the offshore wind zone and Western Port and then going back and forth, it's not quite known at this stage. That would be up to the offshore wind proponents. There could be a fuel barge that goes out into the Bass Strait to refuel them, or they could come into Port Melbourne. We're not quite sure at the moment. There's several alternatives as to how that could be done.
Okay. And Peter, one final design question before I finish on a question of legacy. So how has the impact of stochastic weather and high winds on the port operation and vessel operation been assessed?
Yeah, good. So first of all, the location of the Renewable Energy Terminal, it's in quite a sheltered location in terms of the waves and the sea swell. The vessels that will be visiting the port are, international vessels that, travel out in all sort of different seas and conditions. The offshore installation vessels in particular are working out in the Bass Strait in pretty severe conditions. So the conditions that the vessels will experience within Western Port are pretty insignificant compared to what they experience when they're out in international waters. In terms of how the wind, so the stochastic weather and high winds on the port operations, how that may affect, the main effect will be with the winds. So when you're unloading with large cranes, these heavy turbine components and large turbine components, there'll be wind limits put on the operation. So if it's too windy, it wouldn't be safe to go and operate. But it's all, this sort of operation happens around the world in a number of overseas wind ports, offshore wind ports. So there's a good understanding about when you can and can't operate.
Yeah. Peter, and one final question, and I think, Natasha, if you would like to provide some commentary on this as well. It's good to leave a renewable energy legacy, but what legacy will you be leaving Western Port?
Look, I might start and then I'll hand over to Natasha's thoughts. So definitely renewable energy, this transition to net zero, Port of Hastings, we've got a lot of fossil fuels coming through the port that will diminish in time, and we would like to position ourselves as part of that transition to net zero in terms of the legacy that it will leave Western Port. I'm hoping what everybody's heard today is that from building this terminal, we will have some impacts. You can't avoid that. However, it's the measure, which will go through a very detailed process of state and federal government approval, and the measure to not have an unacceptable impact on the ecological character of the Ramsar wetland. That's the environmental threshold that we need to convince both state and federal government that won't have the impact. And certainly what we're finding at the moment is it's just a small and localised impact. So, look, I'll hand over to you, Natasha, if you've got any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think whether this project is approved or not, we will leave a legacy in terms of the volume of studies and knowledge that we have gained on Western Port. I know that there's a huge amount of work that's been done over many years, but we've been undertaking studies that haven't been done before. As Peter Crockett said, we've been doing underwater noise and lighting studies and bird tagging studies that really allow the community and the science-based community to better understand Western Port and how it functions. So I think that is a legacy in itself that this project will leave, in addition to things like job creation and stability of the local economy.
Great. Thank you. That concludes our Q&A session. Now, with 1 minute to go, I just want to close proceedings to say that if you had any further questions or you'd like to discuss anything further with us, please don't hesitate to get in touch via the above contact details on the screen. There's also some other ways where we're out and about in the community where you can learn more about the project. In September, we're going to be running more community information drop-in sessions plus roundtables. And I encourage you to sign up to these, and we will be sending out more information about locations and timing, etc., in the coming weeks. We also have several project webinars similar to the one that you've heard tonight, just covering different topics. These are all available from our website. And you can also view the attachment, I think it's attachment 10 in the EPBC referral materials, which outlines our engagement methodology and just gives an outline of our consultation that we've done to date on the project if you're interested in understanding how to get involved. Also, you can visit our website, register to our e-newsletter for regular updates. And again, we will also be sharing this webinar with you in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Your feedback is really important to us and for helping to shape this project. So thank you and good night.